I come to the floor probably to explain to my colleagues something I've done on 3 or 4 different occasions, and nobody ever seems to get it right. So I'm back here again trying to explain something so we don't have to deal with it again. So here we go again. While I was traveling throughout Iowa meeting with constituents, I kept my eyes on news reporting out of Washington, D.C. I've seen a lot of bad reporting in my time. The events that occurred starting on April 30th are there at the top of bad reporting. The Washington Post, the New York Times, and NBC all had to retract their reporting about Russian disinformation warnings given to Rudy Giuliani. I'm not here to talk about Rudy Giuliani. I'm talking about how this report affects me and Senator Johnson. Because unfortunately, in the Washington Post article, my and Senator Johnson's investigations into the Biden family's financial dealings was tethered once again to Russian disinformation attempts. And that tethering is what I've been here on the floor of the House over the last maybe more than a year now, trying to explain that that just is a big hoax. The report was based on anonymous current and former U.S. officials. Apparently, the Washington Post still hasn't figured out how to read a Senate report. My staff also spent many hours talking with the Post the day before the story ran in order to help them understand. And I presume they called us, we didn't call them. So I'm going to quote from my staff's emailing them the following, which in the end, the Post completely ignored in their article. So here's a long email. Senator Grassley's report with Senator Johnson relied on Obama-era U.S. government records and information from a Democrat-aligned U.S. lobby shop, which employed Teleshenko while representing the corrupt Ukrainian gas company, Burisma. The email goes on. Senator Grassley never received a defensive briefing related to his oversight of the Biden family's foreign business ventures. Discussions with the FBI and the intelligence community were initiated by requests from Democrats, as is detailed in Section 10 of the report. The FBI and members of the intelligence community indicated last year that there was no reason for the committee's investigation to be halted, even with knowledge of Teleshenko's limited involvement. See report page 59, the email says to the Post. Continuing to read from my staff's email to them. The report and its underlying transcripts further reveal that Teleshenko had deep and long-standing relationships with the Obama State Department officials, National Security Council staff, and left-wing lobbyists. The transcripts also illustrate that material created by Derkach was introduced by Democrats, not Republicans, and it was quickly rejected by an expert witness as disinformation. And then in parentheses, see Minority Exhibit J and George Kent's response to minority staff regarding that exhibit, parentheses. Continuing to record from the email to the Post. following a classified letter authored by Democratic leadership, portions of which were later leaked and reportedly referenced derived, Democrats again sought an FBI and intelligence community briefing, which was provided in August of 2020. At that briefing, the FBI stated that it's not attempting to, and these are the words that the FBI used, quash, curtail, or interfere in the investigation in any way. And then in parentheses, it says, see report page 59. That's not the sort of direction provided at defensive briefings, my staff's email says to the Post. Then continuing to quote, obviously, we didn't rely on any of this for the report's findings on Hunter Biden's and James Biden's extensive financial entanglements with questionable foreign nationals, including some connected to the Communist Chinese government. Subsequently to the report, the public has also learned that Hunter Biden is under criminal investigation relating to his financial entanglements. Given Teleshenko's long-standing ties to Blue Star Strategies and Obama administration officials, are you similarly asking them whether they played into some Russian push narrative? Now, I'm going to go back because that question needs to be repeated. It's not repeated in the email I'm reading to you. Given Teleshenko's long-standing ties to the Blue Star Strategy and Obama administration officials, are you, meaning the Post, similarly asking them whether they played into some Russian push narrative? Continuing to quote, given that Democrats introduced their Koch material, are you similarly asking them whether they played into some Russian push narrative? Now, that's the end of the quote, and I think those last two questions indicate, because obviously the newspaper article doesn't say that they asked these questions that I repeated one twice, and then the other question. They aren't really interested in getting to the bottom of this. Now, after all this information and the long conversations, the Washington Post op-ed opted for unnamed sources rather than on-the-record comments from my staff. So they had an opportunity to quote Grassley and explain all this stuff, and what do? They use an anonymous source. Maybe the Post should work on putting more investigation into so-called investigative reporting instead of focusing on false Russian disinformation narratives. For example, maybe spend some time investigating the Biden staff ties to Chinese nationals connected to the communist regime, military, and intelligence services. I've addressed these Russian disinformation issues at length in my committee report with Senator Johnson, as well as right here on the floor of the Senate 3 or 4 times over the course of many months, maybe stretching into more than a year. I'm going to do this again, even though I've got better things to do. If you want every detail, read Section 10 in our September 23rd, 2020 report. On July 13th, 2020, then Minority Leader Schumer, Senator Warner, Speaker Pelosi, and Representative Schiff sent a letter with a classified attachment to the FBI to express purported belief that Congress was the subject of foreign disinformation campaign. A classified attachment included unclassified elements that attempted and failed to tie our work to Andrei Derkash, a Russian agent. This document falsely accused us of potentially receiving material from Derkash. It was pure speculative nonsense that the liberal media ran with as what they would call, or want you to believe, was truth. And you know what it was? It was garbage. Those unclassified elements were leaked to the press to support a false campaign accusing us of using Russian disinformation. Then, during the course of our investigation, we ran a transcribed interview of George Kent. Before that interview, the Democrats acquired Derkash's materials. During that interview, they asked the witness about it. He stated, quote, "What you're asking me to interpret is a master chart of disinformation and malign influence," end of quote. At that interview, the Democrats introduced known disinformation into the investigative record as an exhibit. Now, more precisely, the Democrats relied upon and disseminated known disinformation from a foreign source when the intelligence community warned was actively seeking to influence U.S. politics. But there's yet more. On July 16th, then Ranking Member Wyden and Senator Peters wrote a letter to me and Senator Johnson asking for a briefing from the intelligence community on matters relating to our investigation. On July 28th, 2020, Senator Johnson and I reminded those two senators that the FBI and relative members of the intelligence community had already briefed the committee in March 2020 and assured us that there was no reason to discontinue the investigation that we were involved in. On August 2020, subsequent to these Democrat-led letters, Senator Johnson and I had a briefing from the FBI on behalf of the intelligence community. However, in that briefing, the FBI discussed matters that were already known and completely irrelevant to the substance of our investigation. The FBI also made clear that it was not attempting to, and these are the FBI words, quote, quash, curtail, or interfere, end of quote, in the investigation in any way. Any talk about an FBI briefing warning us that our investigation into the Biden family financial and business associations was connected to Russian disinformation is complete nonsense. Such briefing, or no such briefing, ever happened. Our investigation was based on Obama administration government records and records from a Democrat-aligned lobby shop, Blue Star Strategies. If those records amount to Russian disinformation, then that means the Obama administration dealt in disinformation every day. Which brings me to the ultimate point that I want to bring to attention today. The FBI assured me that the August 2020 briefing, which was a pointless briefing that shouldn't have happened, would remain confidential. That's what the FBI told us, that it would be confidential. However, I was concerned that the substance of this briefing, or at least elements relating to it, would leak, and I knew that once it was, the briefing would be misreported and used to paint our investigation in a false light. That's exactly what happened last week. Although the Washington Post failed, the Wall Street Journal got it right on May the 4th, editorial titled, quote unquote, the FBI's dubious briefing. I'd like to enter that editorial in the record, Mr. President. The editorial began this way, quote, did the FBI set up 2 members of Congress for political attack under the guise of a defensive briefing? It's possible, and Senators Ron Johnson and Chuck Grassley are rightly demanding answers, end of quote. On May the 3rd, Senator Johnson and I wrote to FBI Director Christopher Wray and Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines, asking to meet with them to discuss the August 20 briefings. We need answers, and we need answers now. Why did the FBI and the intelligence community brief us? Who made that decision? At the briefing, the FBI didn't even show us what intelligence product formed the basis for the briefing. I'll tell you this, even without seeing any paperwork, we were already aware of everything they talked about that very day, and it was unconnected to the substance of our investigation. I asked the FBI whether they had any new intelligence to share, because we hadn't heard anything new, and they didn't give us a single new item. So as far as I'm concerned, the briefing was totally unnecessary. Based on the timeline of events, it appears the briefing was done because Democrats wanted it done, which means it was a political decision. The Wall Street Journal ended its piece by saying this, quote, whether the FBI was pressured, duped, or actively political, the Bureau has again landed in the center of a partisan fight. Mr. Wray might want to ask how that keeps happening, end of quote. That's exactly right. The FBI and the intelligence community have lots of explaining to do. We already know that under Comey, the FBI used intelligence briefing as surveillance operation against Trump and his team. Did the FBI and the intelligence community also misuse briefing processes against congressional members? Only Director Wray and Director Haines can answer that question, and so far they have failed to answer those questions. Their credibility and, more importantly, their professionalism is on the line.